everyone, Laurie Spencer here. Welcome back to this History Book Club reading of The Kennedys After Camelot by New York Times bestselling author J. Randy Taraborelli. Please do take a moment to like the video before we get started, subscribe to my channel, and if you want to catch up on any of the previous episodes you might have missed in this series, I will drop a link to the full playlist down in the description where you can listen to every episode back to back. And if you'd like to support all my hard work bringing you these book clubs, check out my wish list at giftapp.com/reallaurie-spencer, where you can select a book that you'd like me to consider for a future book club reading. And if you are a Kennedy fan, you'll find lots of great Kennedy family history books on my wish list for you to choose from. You can also follow me at Real Laurie Spencer on X, Facebook, Rumble, and Substack. You can become a monthly supporter on Patreon or just make a quick one-time donation on Buy Me a Coffee if you enjoy these book clubs and just want to say thanks. Patricia Kennedy Lawford, Pat, who was 46 in 1970, was an outgoing, colorful person with a great thirst for the good life and also happened to be one of Jackie's closest friends. Though the two women were very different in many ways, they seemed to have a deep understanding and empathy for each other, which, according to those who knew them best, stemmed at least in part from the fact that both had dealt with infidelity in their marriages. Pat in hers with actor Peter Lawford, and Jackie, of course, with President Kennedy, and later with Aristotle Onassis. Pat was a different kind of Kennedy woman, said her longtime friend Patricia Brennan, in the sense that she didn't sit back and accept unfaithful behavior from her husband, like Jackie, Joan, Rose, and Ethel, for instance. Instead, she divorced the guy. It was really unheard of in the family, the idea of a woman divorcing her husband. In fact, it hadn't happened before. As Catholics, another level was added to the dilemma because divorce was considered such a sin. Even though the decks were definitely stacked against Pat's freedom, she went for it anyway. If you knew Pat, though, you'd know that of all the women in the family, she was most likely the one to break new ground where this kind of thing is concerned. Given Peter Lawford's nature, most people who knew him were not surprised that his marriage to Pat turned out to be so tumultuous. He was well-intentioned, the nicest guy in the world, but his biggest concern during the Pat years was himself, not her, said his manager and business partner Milt Ebbins in an interview in the year 2000. He said there was also this constant emphasis on fitting in with the Rat Pack mentality, Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., and he never really fit in with those guys. I think the philandering was perhaps his way of fitting in. "I've had more women than Frank," he once told me, "but no one will believe me." I told him, "Peter, you're married to a Kennedy now. At least try to be discreet." He couldn't do it, though. He had to be a show-off. The controversy that his unfaithfulness caused didn't matter to him. In fact, I think he welcomed it. On some level, he wanted to be notorious. But then there was this other side of Peter, a sensitive, warm-hearted side. He could be the greatest friend in the world. He loved his kids, though he really didn't know how to express it. And yes, he loved Pat very much, though, again, he didn't know how to express it. In a sense, Peter Lawford's life was begun under a cloud of controversy. His mother, May Somerville Bunny, was married to another man when she became pregnant with Peter, who was born Peter Sidney Vaughan Allen on September 7th, 1923, in London. When Mary finally confessed to her husband, Captain Ernest Vaughan Island, that he wasn't really the child's father, Island immediately filed for divorce. A year later, in 1924, May Somerville Bunny married the child's true father, Sidney Turing Barlow Lawford, a captain in the British Army who had served in South Africa. Peter began acting early in life, making his debut at the age of 7 in the British comedy Poor Old Bill, starring Leslie Fuller and Irish Ashley. 8 years later, after the family moved to America, Peter made his Hollywood debut as a bit player in Lord Jeff, and then in 1942 was given a more substantial role opposite Mickey Rooney in A Yank at Eton. Though Peter made many successful films in the 1940s, it really wasn't until the 1960s when he linked up socially with Frank Sinatra, with whom he had made It Happened in Brooklyn in 1947, that Peter became truly famous. At that time, anyone connected to Sinatra was thought of as instantly cool, Milt Evans said. Peter brought the idea of Ocean's 11 to Frank, and he was cast in it along with Dean, Sammy, and Joey Bishop. Pat put some of her Kennedy dollars behind the film, thinking Peter would be starring in it. But, much to her dismay, Frank starred in it instead. Still, when you think about all the films Peter had done by that time, 31 by my count, it's ironic that he's most known as one of the Rat Pack. Peter Lawford would make another 17 films after Ocean's 11, including another one with the Rat Pack called Sergeant's 3. However, a falling out with Frank Sinatra over the Kennedys pushed Peter out of the Rat Pack and out of favor with Sinatra for the rest of his life. Some of the Lawfords' intimates maintain that it also marked the beginning of the end of their marriage. At the time, Bobby Kennedy was investigating the underworld with a kind of eagerness you could not believe, recalled Jeannie Martin, Dean's widow. He was determined to not only bring down the underworld, but also J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI, who he believed, we all believed actually, had it in for the Kennedys, because he was constantly having the family investigated for one thing or another. Bobby felt that Hoover was a crook. During the course of his investigations into the underworld in February 1962, Bobby stumbled onto the fact that Sinatra was tied to some very powerful gangsters, such as Sam Giancana. Because of this discovery, Bobby appealed to Jack, telling him that given Sinatra's associations, there was no way he could stay with Sinatra at his Palm Springs estate during an upcoming trip he was taking to California. Frank had been planning on the trip in a big way, really looking forward to it. Frank Sinatra had very strong feelings about Jack Kennedy. He believed that the new president was a great man, someone who had not only inspired the country into service, but was personally inspiring to Sinatra as well. Sinatra had been very helpful in getting JFK elected by stumping for him across the country, and had even produced his victory party after the election. The idea that JFK was coming to Sinatra's home was, as far as the entertainer was concerned, quite an honor. For Kennedy's visit, Sinatra had new phone lines installed for the Secret Service and had even famously built a helipad for the president's helicopter. As a finishing touch, he put up a gold plaque in the bedroom in which Jack was supposed to sleep that said, "John F. Kennedy slept here." Though the story of what happened next has been told many times, it's still worth repeating. When John F. Kennedy decided that he wasn't going to stay at Frank Sinatra's after all, he dispatched Peter Lawford with the disappointing news rather than give it to Sinatra himself. As Peter explained to this author, Tara Borelli, in an interview in 1981, this was actually, interestingly, it was on the set of The Jeffersons. Remember that old TV show, The Jeffersons? Peter Lawford actually made kind of a rare cameo on that. Some of you might remember that episode. So that's when he spoke to this author, J. Randy Taraborelli, and explained the incident this way. Quote, "I guess you could say that I ended up being the fall guy. One morning, Bobby called me and told me to call Frank and tell him that the president would not be staying at his home because of Sinatra's ties to Giancana. Very reluctantly, I made the call, but I couldn't bring myself to tell Frank the real reason. I said it was because of security concerns. I said that the house was indefensible. That was the word I used. Still, Frank blew up and slammed the phone down. It was actually Bobby who called Frank back and, from my understanding, told him the truth. From that moment on, I was persona non grata where Frank was concerned. It ruined everything between us. What I felt at the time, and what I still feel, is that Frank had such admiration for Jack, he was disillusioned by the fact that Jack didn't come forward to talk to Frank about it man to man. But that's not how Frank did things. If Frank had a beef with you, you knew it. He didn't send other people to do his dirty work. Frank was very disillusioned where Jack was concerned, and I guess had to take it out on someone, and that someone was me. It's always been reported that the primary reason Sinatra cut Peter Lawford from his life was over the Kennedy matter, and certainly Peter suggested as much to this writer. That scenario had always made Sinatra seem a little unhinged, especially added to the often told story, which may or may not be true, that Sinatra then went out to his newly built helipad and, in a fit of anger, destroyed it with an axe. After the Kennedy snub, Frank dropped Peter from the next two Rat Pack films, Robin and the Seven Hoods and Four for Texas, recalled Jeannie Martin. This was so devastating to Peter that it sent him into a deep and awful depression. Peter then took out his frustrations on Pat, feeling that she should have had more influence over her brothers, or at least tried to talk to them about it. But in fact, Pat really had no influence over the situation either. It was completely out of her hands. From all accounts, Pat Kennedy was the least politically motivated of the Kennedy family and definitely the least ambitious. In her 1987 book, The Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys, Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote that Rose Kennedy was bothered by Pat's lack of ambition. Quote, although she had a good mind, a fine physique, and a beautiful face, which could easily have led her to excel in school, in sports, or in appearance, Rose contended she never would make the effort to achieve distinction in any of these areas. Actually, Pat was the Kennedy sister who, as Jeannie Martin put it, loved to have just a good time. She was just a regular gal, and all the stars loved her. Judy Garland, Jackie Cooper, Lauren Bacall, Humphrey Bogart, Martha Ray, Jimmy Durante. She had her problems, of course. She drank too much. Of course, her marriage didn't make things any easier for her, especially the way she ended up stuck in the middle between Peter and Jack. The sixth of Joe and Rose Kennedy's 9 children, Patricia Kennedy would grow up privileged, of course, her background including an education in the finest convent schools with graduation from Rosemont College, a private women's liberal arts school in Pennsylvania. She traveled the world over and, like her siblings, wanted for nothing. Though she probably wouldn't have been thought of as a real beauty, she was striking just the same, with an angular face, red hair, cobalt blue eyes, a sharp nose, and of course that typically full Kennedy smile. Like everyone else in the immediate family, she was also extremely athletic. Before having her children, Pat had been a television producer. She'd enjoyed her brief time in show business and wished it could have continued, but was instead influenced by the Kennedy women's ethos of duty to family. Any thoughts of a career had to take second place to the more practical responsibilities of a mother and a wife. Pat met Peter Lawford in 1949 in London and married him 6 years later. At the time, Pat was 2 weeks shy of 30 and with a personal family fortune of about $10 million. Peter, at 31, was worth about a tenth of that amount. Most of the Kennedys felt he was nothing but a fortune hunter. Joe Kennedy certainly did not approve of him. The fact that Peter was Protestant and English certainly didn't help matters. Christopher Lawford, Pat's son, recalls his mother saying that Joe Kennedy sent her on a trip around the world in the hope that she might forget about Peter. It didn't work, she told her son. I got to Japan and turned right around. It took a great deal of courage for Pat to marry Peter, considering her father's disapproval of him. Eunice and Jean both married men who Joe sanctioned because they were motivated, financially secure, and stable. However, Peter was much more easygoing and laid back, not at all competitive, a lot like Pat in that respect. And while he was hopeful that his life as an actor would continue to work out, he didn't seem all that concerned about the chances that it wouldn't. An amiable fellow, Peter was well liked by the family, even if not by Joe, and especially by President Kennedy. It's fair to say that Peter loved nothing more than being a member of America's royal family, the Kennedys. It quickly became the crux of his identity. He felt that the men in the family Joe, Jack, Bobby, Ted, Sergeant Shriver, and Steve were so inspiring he was just proud to be a part of their lives. He took it all very seriously, the campaigns, the camaraderie, the closeness. And Pat was crazy about him, explained Jeannie Martin. She just worshipped the guy, truly. Unfortunately, despite Pat's strong emotion, the marriage was troubled almost from the start. I don't think Peter was ever faithful, even from the very beginning, said Milt Ebbins. Then, after he got involved with Sinatra and that group, forget about it. His behavior really got out of control. He would be unfaithful to Pat more times than she could count. They had a lot of volatile fights about it. Pat had a temper on her, and Peter gave her plenty of reasons to express it. There was a point around 1963 where she just couldn't take it anymore, said one of her closest friends. I think the difference between Pat and the other women in the family was that Pat just had a lot more anger where the infidelity was concerned. It outraged her in a way that it didn't necessarily outrage Jackie or Joan, for instance. She had known that her father had been unfaithful to her mother, and it just upset her that these men got away with it. She was determined to be the one Kennedy woman to do something about it. She was determined to make a statement, so to speak. But it ate away at her, Peter's cheating. I think it's safe to say that she never really forgave him for it. She was tough, though. Pat would put up a front and act if she was unaffected, but deep down she was very fragile. Her self-esteem was wrecked by his unfaithful behavior, and I think she never actually quite recovered. Pat told Peter she wanted out of the marriage in 1963, confirmed Milt Ebbins. Peter and I then went to Jack and sat down with him in the Oval Office to discuss this. The president was truly concerned. He was very sorry that the marriage was ending, but I think he felt it was Pat's fault, because I distinctly remember him saying, "It's okay, Peter. I know my sister better than you do. I understand, believe me." He asked when it was going to happen, and Peter said it was imminent. I said, "I'm not happy about this. I'm afraid it's going to detract from the 1964 election." And Jack agreed, saying, "Maybe you two should wait until after the election." Peter thought he could get Pat to agree to that. Before leaving, Peter said to Jack, "I sure hope this doesn't mean the end of our friendship." Jack patted Peter on the shoulder, shook his hand, and said, "Don't worry, Peter. I promise I will always be your friend." When we left, Peter was crying. He was so moved by what Jack had said. Then, of course, Jack was murdered shortly after that meeting. Everyone was so devastated, it put the divorce on the back burner for almost 2 years. However, my memory has it that Peter and Pat weren't living together during that time. In December 1965, Pat learned that one way to obtain a so-called quickie divorce from Peter Lawford was to do it in Sun Valley, Idaho, because there she would only need to establish a 6-week residency before filing the necessary papers. Since it was to be the first divorce in the Kennedy family, Jackie felt that Pat would need emotional support, so she showed up unannounced in Sun Valley to surprise Pat. One can only imagine Pat's amazement at opening the door to the small home she had rented in Sun Valley to see her famous sister-in-law and her 2 young children, Caroline and John, standing there, suitcases in hand. And one can also only imagine Jackie's surprise when she found that Ethel and Bobby and their children were already present in support of Pat. Chalking it all up to crossed signals, Jackie, Ethel, and Pat spent 3 days together, during which time they solidified their bond as sisters-in-law, while Bobby spent the days skiing with the many children in his, Pat's, and Jackie's. While in Idaho, Jackie revealed that she had first noticed problems in the Lawford marriage all the way back in 1955. "I'm amazed it's lasted this long," she told Pat, who had to agree. "That's a very long time to be so unhappy," Jackie said. During this time, Peter was involved with a stewardess who worked for an international airline. None of the Kennedy women could believe it. From what I understand, Jackie kept saying, But Pat is so smart and funny. Why would Peter end up with a stewardess? What can they possibly have to talk about? To which Ethel said, "They're not talking, believe me." It's interesting that Jackie, and maybe to a lesser extent Ethel, would be so friendly with Pat. There were arguably a few reasons why the two might have had a problem with her, not the least of which was that Pat had allowed her home out on the West Coast to be used by Jack for his affairs with other women. It had been Peter Lawford's idea, and he was probably pressured into it by Frank Sinatra, but still, it was Pat's house, too. Another reason Jackie and Ethel might have had reservations about Pat was that one of Pat's best friends had been Marilyn Monroe in the later years of the movie star's life. "You're a Kennedy now," Pat told Marilyn at one point in their friendship, which was unusual because Pat and the rest of the Kennedys were usually not very welcoming of outsiders. In fact, when Jack won the Democratic nomination, the Kennedy family was supposed to join him on stage at the convention at the Coliseum in Los Angeles. However, when Peter Lawford started to walk on the stage with the rest of them, Pat stopped him. "You're not actually a Kennedy," she told him, "so I don't think it's right." Jack overheard her comment and said of Peter, "He's married to you, so that makes him a Kennedy, don't you think?" She just shrugged. "Besides, he's a good-looking movie star," Jack added with a wink at Peter, "so we can certainly use him up there." Peter had even taken the citizenship test just to become an American so he could cast his vote for JFK, but it didn't much matter to Pat. So for Pat to tell Marilyn Monroe that she was a Kennedy was quite unusual, and for Marilyn to then get involved with Jack, and maybe Bobby, was, as far as Pat was concerned, a bit of a betrayal. "Pat was torn about it," said Patricia Brennan. "On some level, I think she never really believed that Marilyn, Jack, and Bobby had anything serious going on, but there was a lot of evidence to the contrary. I know that she told Marilyn on April 8th, 1962, at Pat's home in Malibu, that if it were true, she might be able to get past it to continue their friendship, but she seriously doubted that her sisters, Eunice and Jean, and sisters-in-law, Jackie and Ethel, would ever be able to reconcile it. These kinds of friendships that sometimes crossed lines of propriety may seem odd, but aren't really strange at all if one understands the manner in which the Kennedys customarily compartmentalized their lives. In the end, according to people who knew her at the time, Pat eventually decided that whatever had transpired between her brothers and Marilyn had nothing to do with Jackie or Ethel. And apparently, Jackie and Ethel didn't hold any of it against Pat. Adding to the unusual circumstances was that Jackie genuinely liked Peter Lawford, too, and sought to maintain her friendship with him, despite the fact that she and Pat were so close. The interesting thing, at least to me, was that the Kennedy women were so intricately involved with each other's spouses, said Milt Ebbins. They were very accepting of the men's faults. It was as if none of the men could really do wrong in the eyes of the women, except if you were married to one of them and he was cheating on you. But even then, the other women were accepting. I mean, look, Jackie and Ethel were very close to Ted, despite what he was doing to Joan. They were both also very close to Peter, despite what he was doing to Pat. I always found that so interesting. Pat would stay behind after all of the Kennedys departed Idaho to ensure her 6-week residency, and the divorce was then granted in January 1966. True to her nature, Pat tried to make her break from Peter seem painless, though it was actually very difficult for her. The beach estate home that she and Peter owned on Sorrento Beach in California was an opulent palace that had been key to the lifestyle she had so enjoyed. The pool parties that Peter hosted at this home at 625 Palisades Beach Road, now Pacific Coast Highway, were the stuff of Hollywood legend. And by the way, I'll just stop to put out there, that home is actually quite legendary. It was built in 1925 for Louis B. Mayer, president of MGM. And so it had always been kind of a Hollywood house. And later, after the Lawfords sold it in the 1970s, Paul McCartney and John Lennon were working there. Kind of, they were thinking about doing maybe a Beatles reunion. And so the first big meeting between John Lennon and Paul McCartney also happened in that house. There are some cool photos of those two together sitting out on the patio of the beach house at Santa Monica. And John Lennon, I believe, rented that home for, several months during his Lost Weekend period. But anyway, back to the book. The acclaimed photographer, Bernie Abramson, whom Peter and Pat considered to be the family's personal photographer, later recalled, quote, "Every celebrity in town would come to the Lawfords for barbecues and cocktail parties. Sinatra, Marilyn, Angie Dickinson, Dean Martin, Judy Garland. When Pat and Peter broke up, I don't know who was more upset, the couple themselves or all of the people who loved coming to the house and enjoying themselves there. Pat was always the perfect hostess. Her brother Jack once told me, she gets that from Mother, Rose. Nothing rattles her in a social situation. Whereas Jackie acts cool and collected, secretly she's a bundle of nerves. But Pat, she actually is cool and collected." It was true. I still see her in my mind's eye, flitting around the room in one of her colorful caftans, a cocktail in her hand, charming everyone in the room. All of the frivolity ended, though, when the Lawfords split up. An inside joke among the family was that Pat was so thoroughly cleaned out the mansion of all its valuables when she left that Peter had hundreds of 5-gallon containers of water delivered to her by truck to New York, along with a note that said, "Pat, you forgot to drain the swimming pool. Peter." In early 1966, however, Pat was determined to get on with her life, and she moved into a co-op at 990 Fifth Avenue. At just about the same time, Jackie moved to New York from Washington. 1 block away at 950 Fifth Avenue lived Jean Kennedy Smith and her husband, Stephen, and their family. "Jackie's children loved Pat and thought she was a hoot," said Jeannie Martin, "so they all became very close. Pat's daughter, Sydney, was Caroline's age, and they would both end up going to the same Catholic girls' school together, Sacred Heart in Manhattan. They're still as close as sisters today. Meanwhile, Pat's son, Chris Lawford, became one of John's best friends. The Lawford children always had a live-in nanny, but when the children were older, Pat would give the nanny a week off every month so that she could be a full-time mom to them. She would also turn the clocks ahead an hour so that the kids would go to sleep a little earlier and give her a much-needed break. In fact, Pat wasn't always the greatest mother. Like her sisters, Eunice and Jean, she could be remote and distant, a trait all 3 women inherited from Rose. After Peter and I had Christopher, Peter was very unhappy because the baby cried all the time and the house smelled like shit, Pat told Jackie at one dinner party in front of others. So we decided it would be best if little Christopher had his own apartment down the street in Malibu. He was about 2 months old, actually, maybe a little young for his own place, she said with a grin. But we rented a very nice apartment for him anyway, and he and the nanny slept there. It was just a lot easier on everyone. The problem that Pat's children faced was that, unlike their cousins who had their fathers, Sergeant Shriver and Stephen Smith, to turn to for parental affection and validation, Pat's children had no one after Peter Lawford was out of the picture. It would be Pat's only son, Christopher, who would suffer the most. Pat's daughters would somehow survive their troubled adolescences, but Christopher very nearly would not, as he became addicted to alcohol and drugs. Thanks to Joan Kennedy, who took her nephew to his first Alcoholics Anonymous meeting in the mid-1980s, Christopher Lawford would eventually be able to clean himself up. He remains sober to this day. I guess the paradox was that those kids really were Pat's whole life, said Patricia Brennan. She kept scrapbooks of everything they ever did. She kept every note, every photograph. She treasured every moment with them. But there was always something that just kept her from truly connecting with them, and it had to do with Peter. She was so hurt by what she went through with Peter that something in her just clicked off. She wouldn't let anyone in, even her children. She became very protective of her emotions, very guarded, even in her friendships. She was aware of it, too. In fact, she was always a very self-aware person, even if she was emotionally damaged by her circumstances. I think the same could be said of a lot of the Kennedy women who had been so very hurt by their unfaithful husbands. I remember Pat once saying, quote, "Something vital in you dies when you know for a fact that your husband is a cheater. And that thing, whatever it is, can never be brought back to life. I think it's your soul," she told me. "I think it kills your soul. At least, I think it killed mine." And that is the end of that chapter. Fascinating stuff. I hope you'll join us on the next episode of The Kennedys After Camelot. Until then, I'm Laurie Spencer. Thanks for listening.